among his students was
This call is now being recorded.
his passion that remained till very end. And I am very much hopeful that the academic benefits from this August gathering will help these young students to shape their future vision while studying this subject, and that will fulfill my furthest dream. So thank you, Dr. Zaweed and Sajjad, Professor Sajjad, uh, for this memorial lecture.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you, ma'am.
Now, Sajjad sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Salim Javed and Dr. Kasturi Mukherjee. I am deeply honored to have been asked to speak in memory of Professor Subodh Kumar Mukhopadhyay. I learned that he had a passion for history and did a lot towards teaching and researches in different colleges and different parts of Bengal, as also in and around Calcutta. I guess he may have been near contemporary of my late father in the Calcutta University, who earned his graduate and postgraduate degrees from the Calcutta University in the 1960s and went back to teach in a rural college in North Bihar. To this extent, they possibly shared some of the common traits, professional traits, if I may say. Though we have no way to know whether the two knew each other on the campus, because both of them have passed away sadly. I chose to speak on a topic I should have better avoided, had I been, so to say, in my right senses. Why? Because speaking on such subject before a Bengali intelligentsia rightly causes nervousness and a confidence deficit. The Aligarh movement, led by Sayyid Ahmad, better known as Sir Sayyid, is not characterized candidly as a renaissance with capital R and within quotes, but it is certainly treated as one of the major reformist movements of 19th century colonial India. So, choice of this topic may possibly be a befitting tribute to Professor Subodh Mukhopadhyay. Even though a debate has been there whether it was a renaissance and whether it was Bengali specific or pan-Indian, I avoid going into the debate not only for the sake of my convenience but also because the debate already stands exhausted and settled. Yet, I am tempted to talk about the Aligarh movement in some comparison with the reformist movements of 19th century Bengal. This has to do essentially with some of the following reasons. One, the scholars like W.C. Smith, Wilfred Smith, in his 1943 book, Modern Islam in India, A Social Analysis, and Jawaharlal Nehru in his book, 1946 book, Discovery of India, made some remark. He observed a time lag of around half a century so far as reformism among the corresponding segments of Bengali Hindus and North Indian Muslims was concerned. If we could make it more specific, Ram Mohan Rai settled in Calcutta in 1814 and Sir Sayyid's college came up at Aligarh in 1877. So we see a time lag of more than half a century. Even though we have we have qualifiers in that. For example, in Delhi already Renaissance had started, as said by Gail Minogue, and this had acquired greater momentum when English medium section was introduced in the Delhi College of Delhi in 1827. So that is one reason. Second, Sir Sayyid, while asking for privileged treatment for his co-religionists of the corresponding class, often referred against the Bengali domination in British Indian education and bureaucracy. Third reason why I chose it On the questions of caste and gender, Sir Syed is seen to be more conservative than many other reformists. Sir Syed had to almost give up his socio-religious reformism for the sake of actualizing his goal of having residential college or university of modern education. Else, he may have lost his fund provider for his subject of residential college of modern education. So this is the fourth reason. Now the fifth reason. Just as the Bengal reformism was largely limited to urban Bengal with very limited impact beyond that region, likewise the Aligarh movement also could not have significant regional spread. Its campaign for a Muslim university with power to affiliate colleges all over India could not be actualized even in 1920. And even in the Muslim concentration cities of Dhaka and Lahore, another residential college comparable to that of MAO College at Aligarh could not come up. So these were the major limitations which can be compared with the so-called Bengal Renaissance or Indian Renaissance, so-called Renaissance of Bengal or India. There is an additional reason as well. There are serious misconceptions in academic and popular circles about the role of Muslims in shaping India's nationhood in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These misconceptions bolster majoritarian accusations against India's Muslims, when it is a fact that all 19th century Indian reformers were unmistakably associated with religious particularism. Yet, the Muslim reformers, writers, and public intellectuals are often viewed as impediments to a quote-unquote united or composite nationalism. So, having outlined the reason why I chose this topic, I will move to the topic. There are two major works. One is by David Koff, British Orientalism and the Bengal Renaissance, which was published in 1969, and another is S.C. Sarkar's collection of essays, Bengal Renaissance and other essays, which was published in 1970. So besides many other subsequent works, these two major works on the Bengal Renaissance hardly leave any scope to discuss the subject. Even the debate that whether it was a Renaissance or if at all it was a Bengal specific or pan-Indian phenomenon, as I said earlier, has been sort of exhausted. Rabindranath Tagore, who unlike Sir Syed lived to see at least 4 decades of 20th century as well, played a key role in formulating ideas about cultural identity, nationalism, in his view of his eclectic grasp of both Western and Eastern ideologies. So during 1886-1898, Tagore had pro-Western proclivities. So was the case with Sir Syed, whereas during 1898-1906, he was extremely anti-Western. I may be wrong, but I do feel that Sir Syed needs a re-evaluation and reassessment with such comparisons in mind, rather than labeling him more harshly than he might actually be deserving. I would therefore refer to his studies on the Bengal Renaissance in a very limited way, in the sense that so far as translation works was concerned, or attempts at rationalist interpretation of religion was concerned, these are the essential features of Renaissance, besides humanism and universalism. So these attributes can be, these features can be attributed to the Aligarh movement as well. So to that extent, this may also be called a Renaissance in as limited sense as one can do. David Koff discusses the process of Indian modernization rather than rebirth of values from India's past. One of the reviewers of David Koff, Rosen Rocher, had pointed out some limitations of the work. But besides outlining those limitations, the reviewer as well as the author makes it very, very clear that a full appreciation of the phenomenon of Bengal Renaissance requires distinguishing between what is gender pattern and what is pan-Indian. and what is specifically Bengali. For example, Sir Jadunath Sarkar in 1928, he regarded the whole 19th century as a century of Renaissance. Was it really so or not? I leave it for the historians to decide. But so far as role of intelligentsia is concerned, this is a Russian term, to the class of intelligentsia, Toynbee assigned a function that they act as mediator between cultures. So in the light of this definition, Ram Mohan Rai, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, all others called the phenomenon as Renaissance, simply because there was a class of intelligentsia who was trying to mediate between the two cultures or different cultures, not only the Western culture and Indian culture, but also different cultures of India. So European impact and Indian response as a juncture of acculturation and diffusion for a both-way process of cultural encounter and exchange. This is how we have to understand the reformism of 19th century or Renaissance, whatever we choose to call. Koff identifies three major roles for the reformists or intellectuals of 19th century, and he interestingly goes on to say that, like the Hindu philosophy, the reformists combined three roles in themselves: the roles of creator, the roles of destroyer, and roles of preserver. In terms of creation, they were creating new levels of social consciousness. And in terms of destruction, they were trying to destroy decadent social behavior. And in terms of preservation, they were trying to preserve the social ties with family, kin, and transcendent society of the sacred. And in taking up this kind of gigantic task, one could see a disparity between word and deed, between public performance and private behavior. So these kinds of contradictions one would find in all the 19th century reformists, be it Ram Mohan Rai or Sir Syed Ahmad. Ram Mohan Rai was the greatest figure of the first phase of the Bengal Renaissance, whereas Bankim Chand Chatterjee reflects the second phase, when reformism also gave way to revivalism and also some conflict with Western cultures, which manifested very clearly. And the third phase is said to have commenced when Western imperialism faced nationalist resistance, and this came to be represented by Rabindranath Tagore. So, and this is the kind of classification which has been reiterated by Professor K.N. Panikkar in his essay in Frontline, March 3, 2017. He also identifies, in a different way rather, three distinct phases of Renaissance. And he calls the first phase of Renaissance as the socio-religious reform movements, which is pre-political phase, in which there were inquiries into the past, there were assessments of the strength of tradition to overcome the contemporary problems. But the intellectuals who spearheaded the movement were not Anglophile Indians. They were rooted in the Indian traditions. And alien and indigenous traits were combined meaningfully to produce a desired change. So my submission here is that while making an assessment of Sir Syed and Sir Syed-led Aligarh movement, we need to employ these tools, these considerations, to invoke these considerations while assessing the history of the Aligarh movement or the whole public activity of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So, for long, scholarly attention on Sir Syed and his movement remained largely inadequate for a variety of reasons, because for long, writings and speeches of Sir Syed remained published in a very limited way. There was inadequacy in historical researches on Sir Syed and Aligarh movement till Lely came out with his book Aligarh's First Generation in 1978. Because most of the sources came to be published only as late as in the 60s. We also know that Sir Sayyid's rationalism was disliked by the Muslim conservatives, and hence they were derided in those circles and writings. Till the 1930s, we find scores of Urdu writings which hardly show much admiration for Sir Sayyid. Similarly, in the liberal secular historiography, he was identified as progenitor of Muslim separatism and communalism. And this got reinforcement from Pakistan's historiography, which seeks to obtain antiquity to their brand of territorial separatism. Third handicap in researches or meaningful researches or holistic researches on Sayyid Ahmad and his movement is that there is a deficit of Urdu reading scholars or historians. So there is another handicap. Even then, of late, research works have started coming out in that domain on that subject, which we are discussing today. Before we elaborate upon it, one can easily find the kind of three stages which have been identified by David Koff or later by Ken Panikkar. These three stages can easily be found in Aligarh College, Aligarh movement as well, in Aligarh College and University, which has been articulated in Urdu essays of Kumar Muhammad Ashraf, who writes that in the Aligarh of the 1920s and 30s witnessed a powerful group of anti-colonial as also left-leaning groups. So was the case during the 60s, with which we are not concerned at the moment. This aspect of Aligarh, Aligarh movement essentially identified with loyalism to the British rule, but challenged by other works. As I said, was first articulated by K.M. Ashraf in his Urdu essays. Later, Mushirul Hasan also articulated and elaborated upon this aspect in his two major essays. One was published in 1985, Nationalist and Separatist Trends in Aligarh, 20th Century Aligarh, and his another essay, Recalling Radical Days in Aligarh. Besides his 1998 lecture in Paris, also elaborated upon those things, but there were many aspects of Sir Sayyid which he missed. So the point we are trying to underline here is that just as the so-called Indian Renaissance had different phases and it kept evolving, the Aligarh movement also had its different trends coexisting or evolving, conflicting trends as well. So another significant contribution of the so-called Renaissance is said that it contributed to the formation of a new Indian middle class and assisted in the professionalization of the intelligentsia. On this count also, Aligarh movement can be credited to have produced and organized certain proportion of middle class among North Indian Muslims. David Lelyveld refers to this class as Kacheri milieu, who came forward to safeguard his class interests. So this is how we need to assess Sir Sayyid and his project of modern education. Not only Sir Sayyid, his associates and he also represented and articulated certain aspects. We are coming to that point. Sir Sayyid's associate and biographer Altaf Hussain Hali, he actually composed a long poem, Qaum Ka Mutawassit Tabqa, the middle classes of the Qaum. This was on middle class, a long poem, and he also defined his notion of middle class in a footnoted prose. This was composed for and recited at the 6th session of the Educational Conference, Aligarh, 1891. He understood the middle class like this. About the middle class, that is mutawassit darja or tabqa, he said that this class is wealthy. It has got wealth and renown, which it earns with personal effort, with self-help. He uses the word self-help, doesn't translate it, and education and skill. Whereas there is another class of poor and deprived is adna darja, who don't want to make progress. This is how he defines. There is ala darja. He is pejorative about that class also, the upper class, who are complacently and smugly rich and don't want to do anything to make progress, idle enough not to do anything to arrest their material and moral decline. So Hali wrote against colonial plunder, caste-based and gender-based discrimination and oppression of the peasantry. He had high expectations from the emerging middle classes too, but these are lesser known in Urdu literary circles and almost absent from historical and social sciences. He wrote poems like Hubbe Watan, Munazara Rahmo Insaf, Qawmi Khidmat, and Hali also established a girls' school in his native place, that is Panipat, as early as in 1894. Throughout 1880s, Hali wrote essays like Kya Musalman Tarakki Kar Sakte Hain? And he raised the same question in another essay from July 1895, and also from his presidential address at Karachi in 1907. We find that he persuades Muslims to work to develop their capacity through independent professions rather than through government services. His poems Banange Khidmat in 1887 and Falsafa-e Tarakki are of particular importance. Hali was therefore a strong advocate of the economic boycott of the Swadeshi movement, and I would like to point out here that in fact it was the insight taken by W.C. Smith and Jawaharlal Nehru in his discovery of India, that there was cause of communalism, Hindu-Muslim communalism, was because there was a lag of almost half a century of the so far as the formation of modern middle class among Muslims is concerned. So this insight was taken from Hali's writings, because Hali wrote a playwright and also an essay, and through which he explained all these things, and he put a blame on the colonial rulers that they are trying to create wedge between Hindus and Muslims, and therefore this decision of the British to divide Bengal on communal lines in 1905 needs to be resisted, and he appealed to the Muslims to extend their support to the Swadeshi movement, to the boycott movement. So these are the aspects which are lesser known aspects about the associates of Sir Syed, or the people identified with the Aligarh movement, who played their who articulated things in this way. Sir Syed Sir Syed is on the issue of gender. Sir Syed is identified as conservative, but his about which we will be speaking shortly. But so far as his associate Hali is concerned, he started discussing the issue of women in various many ways. He wrote some poems, Chup Ki Daat, and he also raised questions about the limits of reform. Reform ki had. He uses the word reform, doesn't translate into Urdu. So anyway, rather than digressing from the subject of Sir Syed to his associate, let us come back to how Sir Syed evolved in negotiating with the colonial modernity. Sir Syed, by virtue of his family location, had equal access to or possibility of getting his job either in Mughal administration or in East India Company administration. But it may be attributed to his farsightedness that he chose not to get into Mughal administrative services. He chose to joined the East India Company services, first as an assistant in 1838 and then as Naib Munshi in 1839 in the Commissioner's Office of Agra. Here he could understand the mechanics of colonial administration here at Agra. He also wrote a tract on their administrative regulations, which earned him laurels. And during the period of 1840 to 1849, he also wrote many religious and historical books, including Asarus Sanadib. Thus, he is still looking into his proud past, if one could say it, so much so that in 1855, Ghalib had to reprimand him for remaining stuck to the Mughal past. But Sir Syed, even after coming around negotiating with the British ideas and institutions and cultural practices, did not acknowledge Ghalib, nor did he write his obituary in Aligarh Institute Gazette, which is surprising for me. But even in his writings on medieval Indian rulers, he chose Akbar instead of Aurangzeb. It signifies something about Sir Syed. And Hafiz Malik notes it, notwithstanding his further evaluation of Sir Syed, which to me and to many is just unacceptable. Therefore, what we see that till 1859, Sir Syed did not seem to have taken up an emancipatory role. His diagnosis led him to concentrate on education, yet he would take another few years to understand if vernacular would be the way or English language would be the way out. Meanwhile, he is trying to create a reconciliation between the Muslims and Christians, that is the British rulers and Muslim subjects, and he wrote texts like Tabinul Kalam, and he then started talking about theology and reform. So there is an evolution in his personality and in his outlook. Therefore, we need to rescue Sir Syed's image from a mere identitarian and minoritarian to someone who also championed many other issues, if we may use the phrase economic nationalism, which he did espouse throughout 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So his writings, his editorials, his essays on these subjects remained less attended by professional historians. Other people have started taking it up. Some Urdu monographs have appeared, have started appearing, engaging with these kinds of writings of Sir Syed. So in 1860, when famine struck the United Provinces, Sir Syed was posted at Muradabad as Sadrus Sudur. John Strachey was the collector. Sir Syed was entrusted with the task of supervising the famine relief. He discharged his responsibilities with diligence and efficiency. His biographer Hali says that he made efforts not to let the starving Hindus and Muslim children be taken away by the Christian missionaries, and that Sir Syed had then resolved to raise funds to establish a huge, well-furnished orphanage for better food, lodging and education of the children. Sir Syed later submitted a memorandum. This was in June 1883, much later, insisting on the government to establish agricultural development banks in rural areas. He also wrote that agrarian improvement had to be taken up. The state had to facilitate irrigation facilities so that agrarian production could be enhanced. And he spoke against the loot of or exploitation to which people were subjected by Mahajans and Saukars, that is the money lenders. He also demanded amendments in the existing farm laws to help the farmers by reducing the revenue extraction by the British rulers. In fact, when he wrote his tract, Causes of the Indian Revolt in 1859, this was one of the earliest texts from an Indian to have spoke against the colonial exploitation to which the Indians were subjected, Indian peasantry was subjected. And he outlined in this tract that root of the people's discontent against the British Raj was the agrarian exploitation, and which drove the people to rebel against the Company Raj in 1857. In 1878, when the colonial law was legislated, which affected the environment of India, Sir Syed again emphatically pointed out that the rail expansion resorted to deforestation of India, and the colonial law of 1878 is through which the state had taken control of the forests is leading to shrinking of the pasture lands for the livestock of the peasantry. It is also creating a scarcity of wood for cooking fuel. So he wrote many other in great details on all such aspects throughout 60s, 70s, 80s. These were the concerns in Sir Syed's mind when he launched his scientific society in 1864 to combine scientific education and research with agriculture, and where he he took non-Muslims also along with his project, and a huge translation work was undertaken by him. Here it should be pointed out that unlike the reformist organizations of pre-1857 period in Calcutta, which did not take other people along, about which Niraj C. Chaudhary also commented rhetorically that Bengal Renaissance was a feast to which Muslims were not invited. So unlike this, Sir Syed was taking people along with himself. It was only on the Urdu-Hindi controversy that Sir Syed came to write and speak in a manner which makes him identified as an exclusionary person, as a minoritarian, or as someone who was obsessed with identity question or class question. So the way Sir Syed was negotiating with colonialism, of course, for his specific class of a particular region, but still Sir Syed needs to be re-evaluated and reassessed as to how he was trying to create a Raj and Qaum equilibrium, how he was trying to create an atmosphere of reformism among his co-religionists. Though in later years he had to concentrate only on education, and even in and giving up the political the politics of confrontation with the British state. This had possibly to do with his belief in the fact that there was a character of permanence in the British rule in India, the way Muslim rulers had come from somewhere and settled down in India as a permanent resident, so to say. So this is how he rationalized his study of history. Sir Syed's study of history led him to rationalize that likewise the British rulers have also come here to exist as permanent rulers in India, and therefore a negotiation with them should be there, a reconciliation with them should be there, rather than a confrontation. In order to make his educational project successful, he had to give up his reformism. Otherwise, he would have lost his fund provider, because there was an opposition from Muslim conservatives against any such scientific reinterpretation of the religious texts. So he gave up all those projects as a in his pragmatism, and he concentrated on developing his residential college of modern education. Even in this project, he had to be pragmatic, and he had to contradict himself. At times he would insist on vernacular education. Then he will realize that no, vernacular mode will not work, and Urdu Hindi dispute is taking the things into a different direction. So he says that no, translation works may help only to an extent, otherwise translation projects have not been helpful in letting the people actualize higher education, and therefore he would now insist on English medium education, and this is how he visualized his own educational institution. What happens that even that after Sir Sayyid, even though the Mohammedan Educational Conference survives and conducts its annual sessions till 1945, but only two educational goals, in terms of educational goals, only two goals could be actualized by the Mohammedan Educational Conference. One, that the college was developed into a university by 1920, and two, a college for girls was also opened, and that too at Aligarh only. Now the question is, why, despite this Mohammedan Educational Conference, even in a Muslim concentration city like Lahore or Dhaka, a residential college of modern education like that of one at Aligarh could not come up. The Mohammedan Educational Conference did not do enough towards establishing such kind of institutions in different parts of India, residential colleges in different parts of India. There is an interesting thing that when the MAO college was campaigning to raise itself up to the status of university, there were resistance from various corners, from Punjab, from Bengal also. And in order to placate the Bengali Muslims, in 1904 at Rajshahi, Mohammedan Educational Conference had to be convened, because the Bengali Muslims were asking a question to the Mohammedan Educational Conference, that what will they gain if this college is raised to the status of university. So in reply, they were told that this university will have power to affiliate different colleges from different parts of India. Only then some Bengali Muslims could join the campaign of MAO College to become university. And when it became university in 1920, it did not get the power to affiliate colleges across India. So that way, other people were let down by the movement, because the Mohammedan Educational Conference then onwards became more and more political, rather exclusively political, and they paid least attention to educational uplift or upgradation of the community they talked about. So this was one limitation of the Aligarh movement. There were certain merits. For example, historian Iqtidar Alam Khan, in his very brilliant essay, which is a Mujib Memorial Lecture of early 90s. In this essay, he assesses the contribution of Aligarh movement in rational and scientific history writing, and in which he sort of gives good score to the Aligarh movement, that even though Sir Sayyid helped Eliot in writing many things, but one of the associates who can be identified with the Aligarh movement, that is Muhammad Hussain Azad, he in his writings exposed Eliot's style of history writing, wherein he institutionalized, he created and institutionalized Hindu-Muslim communal differences, because the way he wrote history, the way he looked upon India's past and articulated it and wrote it in his History of India, was enough to create communal consciousness, and it created polarity between the two communities. This is the way the colonial administrators prepared their textbooks, against which these Aligarh people kept raising voice, kept exposing the passages and the ways in which the textbooks were being written. So this is one contribution. Another contribution we can point out that the Aligarh movement did help in creating certain proportion of middle class who could uh, who could who could sustain reformism of Sir Syed in whatever to whatever extent. Uh, To quote Mushirul Hasan in his essay, the Aligarh reformer was no religious bigot or no Hindu bigot. He was more tolerant and broad-minded than many of the early Congress leaders. He worked closely with Hindus in the scientific society and other associations. Now the question arises as to why did Sir Syed go against the Congress? Because when we say that the middle classes acquire different kinds of characters, and in course of time they became the resources of anti-imperialist mobilizations, and on that count Aligarh movement cannot also be faulted, as I said, that K.M. Ashraf, Sayyid Muhammad Toki, and there were many other figures who by the turn of the 20th century, in early decades of 20th century, they turned anti-colonial, they asserted against British colonialists, and this is how Jamia Millia Islamia came into being. And in the 20s and 30s, in the decades of 20s and 30s, there were enough proportion of Aligarh students and people who were against British colonialism and who were towing the nationalist lines. But then, how do we explain Sir Syed's opposition to the Congress? On that count, an Australian scholar, Dennis Wright, published an essay in 1989. He identifies three major phases in Sir Syed's treatment of Congress, or Sir Syed's reaction on Congress. He says that from 1885 to 88, Sir Syed was opposed to the National Congress, but from 1889 to 98, he left the political arena and he concentrated more on developing his own residential college, which itself underwent many phases, and we are leaving out those details. Sir Syed was consistently opposed to Pan-Islamism, and because Pan-Islamism taught extraterritorial loyalty, and Sir Syed was deeply rooted in indigeneity, and his historical writings also would testify how much was he concerned and how much did he identify himself with Indian past, be it the ancient past or the medieval past. So he was, and his opposition to Pan-Islamism brought him face to face with Jamaluddin Afghani. And this is why Sir Sayyid never talked of Ummah. He always talked of Qawm, because Ummah had a pan-Islamic connotation, a worldwide connotation. The Qawm has got only an Indian connotation. So he talked of Qawm, not of Ummah, even though his Qawm is also having different meanings in different times, and at one point of time in one of his writings, Sir Sayyid tried to clarify what did he mean by Qawm. At times he would use Bengali Qawm, Kayast Qawm, Brahman Qawm. So for caste, he also uses this term for a specific caste, for a specific class as well. At least once he uses the word nationality for Qawm, and he writes, he doesn't translate many words of English into Urdu. He will write the way it is spoken in English. So Dennis Wright says that pragmatism made consistency impossible for Sir Sayyid. This is what David Koff says about the Bengal reformists, about Raja Ram Mohan Rai, that they could not have been consistent while negotiating with colonial modernity. So this inconsistency and pragmatism was was there in Sir Sayyid's position on politics, in Sir Sayyid's position on education as well. So in education, he, as I said, he first talked of vernacular. Then his first experiment in education at Moradabad was in Persian language. Then he said second experiment in Ghazipur was for Urdu medium, and then for higher education, eventually he comes around the idea of English medium education, and this is why he was opposed to some of the objectives of the Punjab University. So these inconsistencies and pragmatism stand articulated very clearly in Sir Sayyid's writings and speeches. So the scholars and historians need to pay attention to his writings more carefully than it has thus far been paid attention to by the scholars. On gender issue also, the Sir Sayyid's writings of his last 7 years displays some efforts on his part to explain that he should not be seen as patriarchic as he is seen by the scholars. Before I conclude, I would like to raise and share some questions with this gathering as to why did Sir Sayyid succeed in UP, but other reformists like Muslim reformists like Nawab Latif and Amir Ali did not succeed as much in Bengal as Sir Sayyid succeeded in UP. My second query to be shared with this enlightened audience is that the British ruled here with their enumeration technology, that is census kind of exercise in 1872, 1881, 1891, 1901, and with each census, the religio-linguistic or Hindu-Muslim divide or Hindi-Urdu divide or consciousness kept growing. Why? Can we explore more about colonial power play in 19th century? In other words, what I want to share here, that the kind of problems that we continue to face even till date, do we trace its roots in the colonial power play of 19th century? So do we need to study 19th century more intensely, more meticulously than we have thus far been doing? My next question to be shared with you is why Hindu-Muslim compatibility with Western modernity transformed into Hindu versus Muslim? And my last query, but not the least one, that despite the 1909 Act of which provided for separate electorate and 1916 Pact at Lucknow, and despite a Hindu-Muslim cooperation during 1920-23, and despite the rout of the separatist force like Muslim League in the elections of 1937, why separatism kept growing from strength to strength? We all know that till 1937 Muslim League was a marginal force. So in the last decade of colonialism, what was there which made the politics of League so strong? Francis Robinson, in his influential work of 1974, seems to be conscious of this thing. He writes only just only one line and moves ahead. He says, there can be no doubt that British policy played the main part in establishing a separate Muslim identity in Indian politics. So, before we end up or we conclude it inconclusively, I leave these questions here among this enlightened audience to be probed. And one last thing that I would like to share here is that the rational reinterpretation of religious texts and many social customs prevalent among Muslims were sought to be reinterpreted and questioned by Sir Syed. For some pragmatic reasons, he left this project. So now, for this generation, for this current generation, the task is to revisit and to raise those questions and to begin those kinds of rationalist reinterpretation of religious texts and social practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now floor is open for question answer. May I request the audience for their question one by one by raising hand if they have. Adrija Chaudhary, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So, good evening, respected sir, my esteemed faculties, and all the fellow attendees. Firstly, thank you, sir, for delivering such a wonderful lecture. We gathered an immense amount of information today, and I hope that we'll be able to incorporate all the points which you taught us today in one of our assignments, maybe. Well, coming to the question, yesterday when I saw the title of the lecture, which says that it's Indian Renaissance and its Muslim segment, Sir Syed's project of modern education, one question cropped up in my mind that did Sir Syed have any preconceived notion or religious biasness while he was initiating or working for the upliftment of the society? Or did he take all those initiatives or all the programs which he undertook during that time, keeping in mind the entire nation and not particularly his own community? What would be your take, sir?
Very good question you have raised, and without raising this question, the whole discussion could not have been concretized. You see, the 19th century reformists had a limitation that each reformist was suffering from religious particularism. Raja Ram Mohan Rai did not talk of other religious communities, but Raja Ram Mohan Rai and Sir Syed also have a different time. Of course, both of them operated in 19th century, and both of them operated in a colonial society. So many similar traits are there. But also, Sir Syed was speaking in later half of 19th century. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was doing or speaking in the pre-1857 period, in early 19th century rather. So this religious particularism was one trait which was not specific to Sir Syed. It was associated with all the reform movements of 19th century. Even then, Sir Syed was not so exclusive or exclusionary or particularist, so long as the Urdu-Hindi controversy did not come. As I told you that unlike the Bengal reformists, the Scientific Society of Sir Syed had a representation in its organizational leadership from across the communities. The British officers were there, non-Muslims were there, among Hindus, Bengalis, and Hindi-speaking, both people were there. So that way, to that extent, his efforts were ahead of other reformists in terms of taking all kinds of people along. But overall, when you take an overall assessment of all the reform movements, I repeat, there was particularism in all the reformist movements. Arya Samaj, Aligarh movement, Brahmo Samaj, and many other such movements of 19th century. So otherwise, if you look into, I could not go into much details. If you look into Sir Syed's writings on agriculture and other such issues, which are not exclusively minoritarian or identitarian, there you would see that he is concerned. His concern is not limited to Muslims alone. His concern is not limited even to only to the privileged Muslims. Even in his educational project, of course, people do say, and there is a truth about it, that it was to do with a particular class, the privileged class. But even among in that, he was continuously talking of endowment, creation of endowment fund, scholarship, so that the poor could also be taken along in the education. And when he started his public school system, the public school means in the government schools, all kinds of people will come, because during those times, elites used to have domiciliary education. So it was a revolution of kind when a school was opened where all classes, people of all classes, children of all classes will get together in the government school. So in that school also, it was not meant only for Muslims. So that kind of particularism was not there even in, Sir Syed in fact writes that the privileged class were disdainfully looking upon such efforts and projects. So he says that, okay, you can travel in rails where all kinds of people go there, and you don't have touchability and untouchability question there. And in school, you think that the privileged class should not share the space with the other classes in the schools. This is unfair. So Sir Syed is very blunt and very candid in writing these things. That way, I think one cannot say that Sir Syed was so exclusionary as he is, as much exclusionary as he is made out to be.
Thank you, sir. I got my answer. Well, I have another question, so if you may allow me to ask you.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, during the course of your lecture, you mentioned this term that there was acculturation in the reformist movement of the 19th century. So my question would be, how did acculturation play an important role and how did it socially contribute to the reformist movement of the 19th century? If you could elaborate by giving certain examples.
Uh, I I didn't this use of the term is not mine. I have taken it from David Cope's famous book of 1969, British Orientalism and Bengal Renaissance. Uh, I think for more elaboration, the conclusion part of that book is more helpful. And in fact, I was about to say, and I would suggest my students as well, that the conclusion part of that book should be reread. Those who have already read should revisit that chapter. That's a useful chapter. In fact, those reviewers who did not appreciate David Koch's book much when it was published, even they also admitted that the conclusion part of the book is fairly good and brilliant. So this, so far as I have been able to understand from that conclusion, the acculturation, by the word acculturation, Koch means intermingling of East-West, reconciliation between the East and West, and even with regard to the West, the healthy values that could be taken up and a very creative synthesis could be made out of the mix of the East and West. This is how he perhaps meant, because he discusses he makes a very clear distinction between Anglicists and Orientalists, and why Anglicists were resisted by the Indians and why Orientalists were seen with some favor by some of the selected reformists of 19th century. So by acculturation, it is meant that while being rooted in the Indian past and Indian tradition, the decadent social practices which had crept in the Indian traditions had to be weeded out through the help of the Western Enlightenment.
Thank you, sir.
And this is why the early reformists were not Anglophiles.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have one more question.
If other people are not having, you can go ahead.
No, let them ask, then I'll ask afterwards.
Okay, Aditya, just wait for Professor Mehdi, would you?
Hello, Sajad. Wonderful hearing from you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can hear. Well, was it really wonderful?
Yes, and I mean there are plenty of thoughts that you've put in my head, and questions that arise from those thoughts. I absolutely appreciate what you are doing as a wider historical and historiographical effort. Absolutely. I mean, I think Sir Syed has been relegated to boxes, loyalist, the founder of the Pakistan movement, and all of that rubbish that you have very carefully disaggregated. So may I ask a series of questions? They're all interrelated.
Sure.
So one of them is, first of all, I'm not even sure that it's relevant to refer to the Renaissance in Bengal, because I mean, I think well before everyone else, Shumit Sarkar had, in his work, just shown us exactly the point you are making, that the Renaissance was not some break with the past, that it was actually, reformulating tradition, reformulating it to suit the colonial context. So there, your effort is well appreciated, very well appreciated. You're absolutely right that Sir Syed is not the Ashraf exclusionary figure that he's been made out to be, and I think your work has just shown us exactly how much more widely interested he was in the fate of communities suffering under colonial rule or being subjected to colonial rule, well beyond the Muslim community. But I have a couple of questions for you. I'm not entirely convinced that Sir Syed was such a gender equality person. I get your point. No one else was. So I would urge you to rethink that no one was. I mean, we're thinking about a society. I mean, Sir Syed, sort of dies in 1898. No male figure, no male political figure or social reformist figure was truly gender equal. So I would urge you to rethink that. And the record is that, of course, I mean, no one that actually.
I fully agree with you.
Yeah. Can I just continue on one point? I just want to raise another point, Sajjad, with all due respect. When you refer to Sir Syed's attitudes towards the Congress, I was very interested by what you said, but I would like you to reconcile, two positions as I see it. There's that famous speech he made in 1883, where he talks about, what is very loosely and lazily construed to be his two-nation theory, right? When he refers to Hindus and Muslims as the two beautiful eyes of the bride that is Hindustan. And then the turn in a speech he delivers in 1886, when he's actually talking, he's trying to encourage at least Ashraf Muslims not to join the Congress. When suddenly, of course, there is that transition made that you contextualize beautifully. So I was wondering, I mean, there's so much in Sir Syed. You're absolutely right to bring out this very complicated figure whose position is, at the end of the day, again, I'll return to it. I don't see the relevance of the Bengal Renaissance, except that Sir Syed refers in one of his speeches to the reason why he opposes the entry of Muslims into the Indian National Congress, because he says he's not opposed to the Hindu nation, but he has a fear that Muslims entering the Congress will be drowned out by the quote-unquote Bengali nation. So that political position is a very contextualized one. It refers to the whole history that you've told us about, Urdu going away as the official language, everything, the politics of the Northwest province in which he lives. So maybe the latter part is more an invitation to comment. Maybe none of this is a question, but really, thank you so much for such a rich retrieval of Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you. I was expecting this question from the audience on both the issue of gender. My only submission on gender issue is that I'm not defending Sir Syed, the kind of position he took pertaining to women education. I'm simply urging the scholars that in the last 7 years of his life, he tried to explain in great details that, okay, he has not been able to do anything pertaining to gender education. He is urging the people that you look into his explanations,
Mhm.
in which he's trying to explain the limitations he had. So
Hmm.
my only submission is, in the
Yeah.
light of those writings of Sir Sayyid,
Mm.
one uh, one would, matlab, you will find him out to be a patriarchal reactionary on
Mm.
that question,
Mm.
but not as much reactionary as scholars have made him out to be without having read his defense in the last 7 years of his life.
So, so,
And
so can you give me an example? I mean, how
uh,
what I
uh,
said to you in my question is that everyone, every one
uh,
of the reform
every-
revivalists were all patriarchs. So
So
just
he
for
is,
example,
you see, he is welcoming the women physicians who were getting a medical degree at that point of time. He is writing editorials for some of those women, Kadambini Gangli and
Hmm.
reformists like Anandi Joshi and another woman figure as well.
Hmm.
So that is one thing. And on his way to London, he is fascinated with the maid servant who is making so many trips to England and who is reading English newspapers. Uh,
Yes,
so he's
famous.
fascinated with all these women. So the kind of patriarchic reactionary he is made out to be, a person a person with those characteristics would not look upon such kind of women with fascination rather than.
No, can I just, I'm so sorry because I know that piece of writing he did when he was in London, and he says, look at this society, even the maidservants read newspapers. Now you can't interpret that evidence as sort of, some kind of sensibility towards gender equality.
No, the
He's
gender equality he never talked of. So this
Yeah,
is what my submission is. My
yeah,
submission is
yeah.
he was not for gender equality. He was a patriarchic reactionary.
Hmm,
There is no doubt about that. My only submission is
hmm,
that he the degree of there is a difference of degree, some difference of degree. Of course, he cannot be taken out of that.
hmm,
He is a patriarchic reactionary. There is no doubt
hmm,
about that.
hmm,
So the only thing is the degree of reaction in him against on the question of gender,
hmm,
that needs to be diluted to some extent, not to a large extent, of course,
hmm.
only to some extent. Now coming to your another query, that is Congress.
Hmm,
In the 1998 lecture of Mushirul Hassan, he tried to explain this issue,
hmm,
uh, and he puts the blame on Theodore Beg, who was the principal of the MAO College Aligarh.
hmm,
He
hmm,
says that Sir Syed was under great influence of Theodore Beg,
hmm,
and he his college project was suffering from fund constraints. There were many internal crises
hmm,
in his college, and he could not have confronted
hmm,
the British, and the British needed all these kinds of dissensions along many lines, including the communal lines.
hmm,
So he explains it in great detail. The lecture of Mushfiqul Hasan was published in Economic and Political Weekly
hmm,
of May 9, 1998.
hmm, hmm,
In the last segment of that article, which is his lecture in Paris, he tries to explain it and puts a large part of blame on Theodore Beg.
hmm,
So, a reading of those 3-4 paragraphs of Mushirul Hasan on Sir Sayyid and Beg's influence on Sir Sayyid will help you understand the Sir Sayyid's opposition to the Congress. And of course, we are not here to defend his opposition to the Congress. But there are certain aspects which needs to be taken up. He welcomes nomination of Dadabhai Nauroji, and
Absolutely, exactly. So I would submit to you that perhaps Professor Mushirul Hassan's reading may not be a complete reading, may
yes,
not be inaccurate, because I see a consistency in Sir Syed's stance. That of course, I mean, because you have to read it, with that speech he makes in 1886, where he
yes.
takes on John Stuart Mill in that same speech, in that same piece of writing. He says John Stuart Mill's idea of representative democracy will not work in India.
No,
Because
he was consistently opposed to the notion of citizenship and equality,
no, not
because
citizenship and equality. I would put it to you, representative democracy, because as John Stuart Mill saw it, representative democracy would create permanent majorities and permanent minorities, right?
yes, yes,
But
yes.
there is no inconsistency when the Congress is adopting those. So I would urge you to think along those lines, because I think the opposite.
Thank you for those, that very useful suggestion. And let me confess that I have not been able to, thus far, I have not been able to look into the correspondence between Badruddin Tayyabji and Sir Syed.
Oh, that would be invaluable.
Where there is exchange of letters,
Yeah,
Badruddin Tayyabji is urging to join the Congress, and he is urging the Congress not
yeah.
to.
That would be invaluable. So where is that correspondence? Where is it located? I mean,
I would try to find the original letters that has been used by Dennis Wright, whom I mentioned, but I have not been able
Dennis
to
Wright, yes,
find
yes.
the original letters. So I will look into it, and we
So
may find.
I think there is much more continuity between the pre-Congress formation
Yeah.
of Sir Syed's thinking vis-a-vis what is, I mean, 1883, that speech, right? The two nation, the infamous.
By then, Congress had not been formed.
It had not, but the Ilbert Bill was, agitation was full on.
And after 1888, Sir Syed doesn't talk of Congress much. He leaves out political issues, and he concentrates on education
Bill,
project.
Bilkul.
Uh,
And somehow I can't imagine that Sir Syed suddenly had this, schizophrenic break. This is a man with brilliant ideas that are fully thought out. And it's a nationalist historiography, Indian and Pakistani, that wants to see that break, that fundamental break, uh, in the formation of the Congress. And I think your work is suggesting that there's much greater continuity in his concerns that are not narrowly exclusionary. I agree with you entirely throughout that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Yes, sir, my question.
Yeah, okay. So if you allow,
You are there to allow.
Aditya, go ahead. Let's.
If
Yes, with
somebody
both
else
of
is
your
not able
permission,
to,
I will
there
ask.
is no harm, we should go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, in the course of your lecture, you mentioned two terms. One is humaneness and the other one is universalism. And you said that these two qualities were widely prevalent during the Aligarh movement. So, what were the events which took place during that time, or Sir Syed undertook? He initiated any such event uh, through which we can see these qualities in practicality.
I think either there was a flaw in my presentation, or there is some communication gap. I said universalism and humanism were two values which are essentially identified with most of the reform movements of 19th century. Uh, 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 This is how Ken Panikkar explains it, and this position of Ken Panikkar has been incorporated and popularized among the students through the textbook that was compiled by Bipan Chandra and other associates with him, India's Struggle for Independence, the BA textbook. In this textbook, the chapter on socio-religious reform movements, which is contributed by Ken Panikkar, essentializes it, that the reform movements of 19th century had a general characteristic of universalism and humanism. So far as only humanism is concerned, that is the integral part of European Renaissance. So the school textbooks explain it, apart from the reference books. So this is a general feature associated with the reform movements. This is how I said it. You will find everywhere, even in some of the revivalistic movements also, you will find such values to some extent.
Yes, so then I'll definitely look through a few books and get to learn a lot more about this topic then.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite to call upon the Dr. Navrajat Afridi sir to conclude this event officially and vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Javed. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Navraz Afridi. I serve the Department of History as an assistant professor, and I appear before you in my capacity as the convener of the History Department's Committee for organizing lectures, conferences, and seminars. We are immensely grateful to Dr. Kasturi Mukherjee for her generous endowment, which has made it possible for us to host this lecture series in memory of her father, Professor Subodh Kumar Mukhopadhyay. We are extremely grateful to Professor Muhammad Sajjad for delivering the opening lecture of this series. I must also thank everybody who joined us today, and particularly Professor Rai and Ms. Adrija Chaudhary for their questions, which led to a very interesting discussion. We hope that you will continue to join us for our future events as well. Recordings of all lectures that we have organized in the year 2021 are available on our YouTube channel. I invite you to listen to those lectures and also to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you get regular notifications. Thank you very much. Now I hand over the reins to Dr. Javed, the head of the department, to say the closing words.
Thank you, Dr. Navrajat Afridi. Thank you so much, sir, for your informative and most brilliant lecture. And I hope we will see you physically in near future in our department for other more academic endeavors.
Can I just interlope briefly to say a very personal thanks to Sajjad? Thank you, Sajjad, for a lovely lecture. Thank you. I learned a great deal. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.